Hey everybody, I'm Chad of HokuProps, and I'm so excited to be here today because I'm going to be showing you how we here at HokuProps like to take brand new bone, also known as white resin, and give it a lot of life. We're going to be using 4 products from Createx Colors today. We are going to be using their Detail Sepia, we're going to be using their Detail Black, we're going to be using their 4011 reducer, and finally we are going to be using their retarder. Alright, so let's get into it. Okay, so our first step, we are going to mix up our sepia, okay? Just to make sure you guys are getting the same product as me, this is their 0070 Detail Sepia, and that is the Createx Colors Wicked line of paint. We're gonna go ahead and just dispense a liberal amount. Now, our standard mixture ratio when we are putting this into an airbrush is about 10% to paint volume. Right now we are coming in right around 1/4 ounce, okay? And so that means that we would be doing 10% of 1/4 ounce, so 0.025, okay, of an ounce. Now, that's not much. So instead what we're gonna do is just give this a drop or 2 or 3, and then we're gonna stir it and we're gonna see what the viscosity looks like. I am looking to have this have a slightly wetter, almost like half and half consistency. And that's just because I'm actually wanting this to penetrate into and stain this resin. Now, fun fact, most of your resins are urethane-based systems, even a lot of the new MSLA resins, right? Well, this is an aliphatic acrylic urethane blend, right? So this is actually gonna bond with that pretty well. You might even get some cross-linking action going on, right? Once we've got our paint reduced, we're gonna go ahead and just give this 1 or 2 drops of the retarder. The retarder is polypropylene glycol. Polypropylene glycol doesn't like to dry, okay? And so what this will do is inhibit the actual curing process just a little bit, so we have a little bit of extra time to work with it. Now, a good practice if you are putting this through a spray gun. For brushing, it'll be okay not to, but for a spray gun, you're really gonna wanna let this sit for about 10 minutes after you've introduced the 4011, and that's just to make sure that the 4011 has had plenty of time to incorporate into the paint itself. Next up, grab your chip brush, and we're going to de-shed this thing. Easy enough, just pull off the film, and then start trying to tug as much of these bristles out as possible. Now, part of what I love about the design of these horns is we also design them to be easy to work with. On the bottom here, there's a nice little slot. Next up, we're gonna take our brush, gonna go ahead and apply just a little bit of sepia. This brush is a little bit too big for this container, but we'll make it work. Easy enough, just layer this on, okay? You will notice that this paint really penetrates into the actual resin itself. And that's part of what I like about this process. This process works really well if you're starting with a white resin, but you can always put a white base coat of paint on and get kind of a similar effect. But I think you'll see in just a couple of minutes why I like using the white resin so very much for this process, really any of our bones. This will also work for any of your cast urethane resin pieces. So if you're using like Smooth Cast 300, which comes in a basically cures as a milky white, it'll have a very similar effect, right? So we have layered on our first coat of sepia, and next up we are going to just set it down and let it dry. So while that's drying, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to my other unit right here. We'll load this one up a little bit heavier, and I'll show you how it's totally okay for the left side and the right side to have a little bit of asymmetry. You know, part of the aging process, if you kind of think about the natural interactions that this horn would have in real life if it was attached to a creature or a monster or a human, humans can have horns, right? Is that you have to think about the interactions it's going to have with its environment. So let's say this thing's running through bushes and brambles and dirt and debris, all these different things. It's going to load up on the surface. It's going to build up in these lower cracks and crevices, we're starting to try to think about more of the theory of aging, right? Set that aside. Now you can see, even though we use that polypropylene glycol, guess what? It's already dry. So, next step. What's happening if this creature's running through the bushes and brambles is you're gonna have abrasion. Ooh. So I'm gonna use some 220 grit sandpaper, and in a motion drawing towards me, I'm going to try and sand off some of this sepia while trying to retain some of the buildup in this lower crevice. This is why working with the white resin is such a joy for this process. It's because you're actually using the natural properties of that white undertone to create a realistic effect of your discoloration building up. And if you look at a lot of horns already, they have a very similar effect. You can see on these parts where I have these nice large surface areas, it's okay if you stand away from you. It's really just down in here that you want to be cautious of, okay? So you can see the 3D model itself had those striations in it, right? And because resin printer's fidelity has gotten so good, it was even able to maintain and capture that, okay? And so what that allows us to do is have these recessed regions where the paint is still built up in there. And because I'm trying to make sure that this stays flat, I'm not taking that away. It's just giving us some more dimensionality and some more character. Once again, the orientation of this, whether it's in this orientation or this orientation, you're probably gonna not have nearly as much abrasion happening on this inside, but you will still have some. So think of it almost as a gradient. We're going to have a bit of abrasion, removing some of this built up paint, but not nearly as much as like right here on this outside, which is gonna have a substantial amount. Now this one, we're gonna go ahead and set this one aside, right? This is in a pretty good hold position. We're not done yet, but it already kind of looks pretty good, right? We're gonna go ahead and show you how, even though this was built up a little bit heavier, it's still okay. Now I've still got some uncured paint in there. It's not a problem. I'm just gonna take my paper towel and wipe off some of that paint that hasn't set yet. And this process in and of itself, the thing that's nice is this uncured paint is actually going to reactivate some of this down here. So we're gonna actually get some discoloration that's slightly asymmetrical to this one, and that's totally fine. It's actually part of my favorite process. Is kind of every single time you use this technique, you really do get a bit of life out of it, because that's kind of the reality, is everything happens in its own unique way, right? I'm actually gonna grab some heavier grit sandpaper. All right, so here we've got some 150 grit. We're gonna have some deeper scratches on this, but that's really okay. All right, so once again, starting from the front, drag and draw towards you. I'm trying to maintain the contour of this horn, right? And it's because a lot of the things like the bristles and brambles and bushes and trees and limbs and all sorts of things, right? And swords, don't forget the swords. They're going to hook on and kind of pull around that corner. So you're actually gonna have a little bit of motion, right? But also remember, as it's doing this, it's gonna be dragging away. So what you're not gonna have is swirling, okay? This is a big mistake with sanding in general. Try to avoid doing this motion. You're always gonna wanna go in straight lines, right? You can go at a diagonal, that's okay, but don't swirl. That doesn't happen in reality very much. Ooh, you guys just saw something fun. You saw me take this and twist it and roll this inside, right? So when you do that, it prevents your sandpaper from twisting like that, okay? Remember, on this interior, we're gonna go a little bit lighter than what we were doing before. All right, you can see we've got a left horn, got a right horn. This one's a little bit dirtier, but that's okay. This is all set up now, so guess what the next technique is, or the next step? Add another layer. So we're gonna go ahead and take our brush, just dip it back inside and get a little bit more sepia, and we're just gonna rinse and repeat the exact same step. This is a repetitive process. You can do it as many times as you want, because you are able to control how fast, how much the buildup is. Unlike last time I let this fully dry, check out what happens if I take my paper towel and immediately wipe it off. Do you see how it's still staining that surface, creating that really cool effect? Looks really good, right? I'm gonna set this aside and we're gonna now let that dry. There's a couple of spots where you got some buildup. I might actually wanna add some into like these areas right here, right? Yeah, let's do that. Let's build this up really heavy up in here and then just once again wipe off. See, very forgiving. Set that aside. I'm gonna do the same thing with this. Load it up. If you don't have a white resin piece as your base, what you can do is you can get something like Createx. They make old bone white, for example, or if you just take some of the Wicked opaque white and mix it with a little bit of the sepia, it'll give you an off-white color, and you can layer that on your base or on your piece. And then what you're gonna wanna do is put a clear coat, right? A protective barrier over that. And what you can then do after that is you can add just a little bit of sepia onto that surface and then just carefully start removing it. You're not gonna be using sandpaper probably, because you'll probably break through that clear. But you can work back and forth and get a somewhat realistic alternate effect that's pretty close. But man, the white resin really does look great, right? All right, so this is gonna take a minute or so to dry. Come back here. I have a spot I noticed that we just somehow missed. It's okay. Come in here. Okay, that's gonna dry down there. So I will just carefully move up here and repeat the same process. We'll use that heavier grit sandpaper, but I'm gonna be a bit more careful this time because I'm not looking to remove nearly as much as I did last time. Looks pretty good. Go ahead and grab this guy and take our paper towel. We're just gonna pat dry anywhere that's still a little bit wet. That's okay. And then we're gonna repeat the same process we just did. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and set this down and let these kind of just fully dry. All right, so we are good to go with our sepia. I'm really happy with them. They look really cool. But we're gonna add a little bit of extra contrast. We're gonna accomplish that by using the 51 Detail Black. Okay, so in the same way that we mixed up our sepia, we're gonna just get a liberal amount of black. We're going to give it just a little bit of 4011. This helps it dry and set. And then finally, we're gonna give it 1 drop, 2 drops of our retarder. Oh, it's like a 2.5 drop. Okay, next up, I'm gonna steal my popsicle stick and stir this. All right, so let's jump into it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and carefully, I found a sponge brush, carefully add just a tiny little bit of black in these under spots, right? I don't need it up here on the big surface area, it's just kind of in these little crevices, right? And then also, I'm gonna give this tip here a little bit of that black and it's gonna fade into it. So, boop. I'm noisy. That looks pretty good. And then so what I'm going to do next is grab my paper towel. We're going to see how it's stained. Now, if you find that the detail is still too aggressive, something you can always do is you can actually dilute this with clear. And that will dilute the black and allow it to build up a little bit slower. So now we're going to take our handy dandy sander here and just blend those edges. Switch to a slightly lighter grit. Here's another thing that you can do too is I'll just use the side of my my brush here, right? If you take a little bit of your 4011 and I'll just add it to your brush, you can actually kind of reactivate some of that paint. See how that's working? Alright, so I'm pretty happy with my black. We're gonna get a little bit of fine detail sanding and call it a day. So the thing that's so fun about this is you could literally just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over. But we have to call it done at some point. So Pretty easy, right? Pretty cool. This will work for all sorts of different bones. It'll work for things like horns, really anything that is kind of got a white base tone and you want to stain it to look like this. Really works well. Thank you guys so much for watching. We've got brown, sepia, we've got black. Which one's your favorite? Let us know. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.